Welcome back. We're in the final 3 weeks of a series on the book of Hebrews. The writer, we've said, is writing to a group of Jewish converts who are considering turning back to their, old ways and their old faith. And the writer is showing them how Jesus is better. And along the way, he has been issuing some warnings not to turn back. In fact, he keeps coming back to this through the book of Hebrews. It kind of cycles, and he keeps coming back and having these whole sections on warning. Listen, don't turn back. There's going to be consequences if you fall away. He explains in chapter 10 that the true children of God persevere, that they follow through to the end. And last week, the writer gave the longest warning passage yet. If you look verses 19 to 39 of chapter 10, that's all one big long warning passage where we're being told, where those people were being told, and us by extension, don't turn back. He says to these Jewish converts, if you turn back, there's going to be a price to pay. And he mentions some very serious consequences in that passage. He talks about the fearful expectation of the fire of judgment that would come on them. He says to disregard, he uses the term trample underfoot, which wasn't something of violence or something per se. It was more like the idea of just disregarding something. If something's just trampled underfoot, it's because you're not paying attention to it. You're just walking over it. He said to trample underfoot, right, the blood of Christ and the new covenant. This is a very serious thing, to not give proper attention to what the Bible says about this, what God says about this covenant. It's very serious. And so this group, they've suffered already. We know from this history that they had gone through some terrible suffering, and more suffering was coming. It says in this book that they were publicly insulted, they were persecuted, they had been put in prison, some of them. They had to have their property confiscated. Like, they had gone through some terrible stuff. And they could see more stuff was coming, and some of them were really getting discouraged. They're ready to throw in the towel. Well, now, having arrived at the end of the letter, and after much theological treatment, the writer to these Hebrews is going to do something a little different today. He's going to start taking a little different approach. He's going to get to the real influences that are affecting their hearts and causing them to want to abandon Jesus. And that is persecution, spiritual, emotional fatigue that was really setting in on these guys. You see, the truth, guys, most often when people, turn back in areas of their faith, we often think that it's intellectual, but I can tell you it's not. When people turn back, most often it's because of persecution, it's because of spiritual and emotional fatigue. And he's going to address those things very, very clearly here this morning. I've got my notes all turned upside down. When you get tired of just sort of being an outsider all the time. You ever feel that as a Christian? You get tired of being on the outside group. You get tired of being a target for criticism. Christians have become a target in our society, right? We're the problem with everything. We're the haters and the, intolerant. You get tired of swimming against the current. You get tired of maintaining your integrity and the Christian values that you were taught. You get tired of having to filter out all of that sin all of the time for your kids and helping them make good decisions and say, no, you just don't do all the things that your friends do. You get tired of your values not being appreciated. Well, these are reasons why many people don't persevere. And what he's going to show us here this morning is that this all comes down to faith. It's all a question of faith. Some people have faith that sustains them through these difficult trials, and other people don't have the faith. Today, the writer, once again, is going to use the stories of Israel's past, of their heroes, to address this very issue that's at play, the matter of faith. And this is an amazing chapter that we're going to look at today, Hebrews chapter 11. It's a famous chapter in the Bible. We often call it the Faith Hall of Fame, where we're going to talk about the heroes of the faith in the Jewish tradition. The argument that he's going to make here is that the people of God have always been called on to exercise faith. He says, listen, you Jews who are being tempted to turn back, you need to understand that all through our history, we as the people of God, we've always been called on to exercise faith. There's nothing new here. This is the famous faith chapter, and we're going to get into it. Faith in Action is the title that some of your Bibles will have over this section. Let's read the first 3 verses and then get into it. It says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So he starts here by saying confidence Faith is confidence in what we hope for. It's the evidence of things that we still are not able to see. That word evidence is like proof for the things that we still are not able to see. There's a very strong link between the concept of faith and the concept of imagination. Not a lot of people, put these two together, but they're actually very closely related. Scientists sometimes say that the biggest difference between humans and animals is this whole issue of imagination. That we as humans are able to imagine what we cannot see. And if it's present at all in animals, it's very limited. Right? Sometimes, if you have a certain trigger like food or something, the animal will remember further, into the future of what could be. But, humans have a totally different capacity for this, to imagine a better scenario of something that could be better and then to move toward it. This is what it is to be made in God's image. Animals are not made in God's image. We as humans are made in God's image. We can see something that's better and move toward it by faith. Verse 2, it says this is what the ancients were actually commended for. And the writer here is going to build an argument that faith is what God has always wanted. In fact, he says in verse 3, the most basic beliefs that we hold require faith. You say, well, what are those? Well, the belief that God created the universe, that has to be embraced by faith. The writer is saying, don't be surprised if you need faith to embrace Jesus. It says the most basic beliefs have always required that. But the truth is that many people have exercised great faith, and especially in Israel's history, there's some amazing examples, and he's going to go back and draw on these and say, listen, this isn't new to us as Jews, right? The people of Israel have gone through some amazing things, and amazing feats of faith have been performed over the years. And so he's going to encourage them with these stories. So look at what he says here in verse 4. He talks about Abel. By faith, Abel, offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith, he still speaks, even though he is dead. Now, Cain and Abel, of course, were the first children of Adam and Eve. And it says here that Abel brought a better sacrifice than Cain did. If we go back and we look at the story in the book of Genesis, we see that Cain was a gardener, right? He worked the ground. He grew fruits and vegetables. Abel, on the other hand, worked with animals. He was a hunter and a herdsman, and he would, bring the blood sacrifice to God as his offering. And we know from the story that his offering was accepted and Cain's was rejected. Now, I've got a little theory on this, and there's actually, quite a bit to back this up. Some people look at that, and if you read the account in Genesis, it seems very quick in the way that it's mentioned, almost like, well, Abel just got lucky and Cain, made the bad choice or whatever. No, Abel didn't just get lucky. You see, Adam and Eve would have explained the significance of animal death as a covering for sin to their children. Trust me. The fact that they got kicked out of the garden, and in that process that God actually killed animals to provide skins for them to wear to cover their nakedness, which was a symbol for their sin, right? They understood very clearly that blood needed to be shed to cover sin. They would have explained this principle to their kids. And so what we see here is Cain actually having a heart of rebellion toward what God was asking for. And that's why God told Cain in that passage, if you go back and look in chapter 4, verse 7 of Genesis, he says to Cain, if you do what is right, will it not be accepted, Cain? See, and he couldn't tell him that one thing was right or not unless he had given him that information. He knew that he wasn't doing what was right. And it says here that by faith, Abel still speaks. In other words, this lesson of Abel's life continues to teach us something even today. And to these Hebrews, what is it teaching us? Well, it's teaching, first of all, that the wages of sin is death. Right? We learn this from all the way back to the story of Abel, that the wages of sin is death. Sin requires blood, death, to cover the penalty of that sin. And the writer who's driving home the truth of the new covenant in Jesus' blood to these Jewish converts, he's showing them that sin always required blood. Even before the Mosaic covenant, that first covenant, even before that, right? The covenant hadn't come to this point when Cain and Abel, they're the first kids ever born. But even at that time, right, sin required death. He gets to the second example here, verse 5. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. So we see here it says that he was taken, that he did not experience death. And if you go back to Genesis chapter 5 and you see the original story of Enoch, it says in verse 24 that Enoch walked with God faithfully, and then he was no more because God took him away. Again, it's very sort of cryptic. It's very quickly written. But in Genesis chapter 5, if you go back in that genealogy where it goes through all of the different people and the sons that they had and so on, you will see after it gives their story, it says, and then they died. Gives their story, and then they died, and then they died. Apparently, Enoch was taken directly into God's presence without dying, because in that case, it says that he was taken, that he was no more. But it doesn't say that he died. And it's interesting because it says, the thing that it says specifically, both here and in the Old Testament passage, was that Enoch walked with God by faith. And not everyone in his time was doing that by any means. It's actually interesting, if you look at the word Enoch, it's from the same Hebrew word as the word Hanukkah, where it comes from. It actually means dedicated. And that's what you see about Enoch, is that he was incredibly dedicated. He walked with God. He was faithful in his relationship with him. And so the writer here is saying, again, he's saying, you Jewish converts that are listening to me, persevere and you will experience special blessing and salvation. Just as like the picture of Enoch, if you walk with God, you will experience this salvation, right? He's making that same comparison. Enoch walked with God. He was taken. He did not experience death. In verse 6, it says, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. This is one of the greatest verses in the Bible that we should memorize. Without faith it is impossible to please God. And the writer here is showing us that faith is foundational to everything, that it's actually impossible to please God without it. God has a currency, and it's called faith. And if you want something from him, faith is what you have to bring. It's not money, it's not talent, it's not something else. It's faith. That's what he's looking for. You say, why? Why is that so important? Well, he says here, first of all, you need faith to believe even that God exists in the first place. That requires faith. And secondly, it requires faith to believe that he actually rewards those that earnestly seek him. Do you believe that? It takes faith to believe that God is going to reward you for doing the things that he asks you to do. Because first of all, you can't even prove the existence of God. You've got to take that by faith, that he exists. But then also that he's actually going to reward you, that this invisible one that we can't see is going to reward you for doing the things that he's told us to do. It takes great faith. Listen, if you're new to this faith thing, I want to encourage you. Keep on pursuing God by faith. Keep pursuing him by faith, and good things are going to happen. Jesus taught this in Matthew chapter 7. You may remember his words. Look at what he says. He says, and ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be open. Now he's not saying just do it once and it will happen, but in persistence, if you keep going, keep on asking, keep on knocking, keep on seeking, that these things are going to be given to you. The truths that you're looking for will come to you. The writer of the Hebrews is saying, don't give up. Keep going. In verse 7, he gives another example. He says, by faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So we see this example of Noah. God comes to Noah. He says, Noah, I'm going to destroy the whole world. I'm tired of all the sin that's covering the entire globe. And I see that you're a righteous man. I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to build an ark to save you and your family. You, your 3 sons and their wives. You and your wife. 8 people. You're going to be saved. The rest of the world, I'm wiping them out. And so you can see, guys, the faith challenges get bigger as we go through this chapter. You're going to see that as we go through. It's like, whoa, the ante keeps getting upped on all of these challenges, these requests of faith. Genesis 6, verse 9, it says, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. And so we're hearing this term again. He walked with God, faithfully with God. And the writer is going to build this sort of, picture here, a revealing pattern that God uses people who walk with him, that are faithful. In other words, that faith isn't just, revealed when God makes this big ask of us, but that God is actually looking for people that are already acting in a pattern of faith, and then he asks those people to do what he wants, and when they do that, he then makes them part of history. Isn't that beautiful? Then he makes them part of history. He includes them in his eternal plan that he's been working throughout history. It's a great lesson. Be faithful, guys, now in everything that you're doing, and God will come to you with bigger faith challenges. And then you will have a chance to change history in your own special way, in your own little place that God has preordained for you to change the world. Noah is impressive. Most of us want God to use us to save the world. God, use me to save the world. Something so small as that. I would take that. Just use me to save the world. No, Jesus is for that, okay? He may be asking a lot less of you. In fact, if you notice the story here, do you know what he asks Noah to do? Did you notice the glorious request he gave to Noah? He gave Noah the request to condemn the world. Noah's like, that's not a fun job. But that's what God called him to do. Listen, are you willing to do what God asks you to do, even when it's not what you envision? Are you? Because faith requires that. Even when it's not what you would dream up, it's not what your plan would be, when God presents it to you, are you willing to do it? Let's keep reading here. In fact, let's read from 8 down to 16. We're going to look at Abraham. And we've got a lot of information on him. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, and they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, like I said, we're going to spend quite a bit of time here on Abraham, and the writer is focusing on Abraham. Why? Because Abraham's the father of the Jewish nation. Right? He skipped over the other ones, but he's like, I'm going to take some time here on Abraham because he knows his listeners respect Abraham a lot. They will have special appeal, he will have special appeal to these Jewish converts. And he talks about Abraham, and he says, when God called Abraham, he obeyed and he went, even though he didn't know where he was going. And guys, this is why Abraham is praised. This is why he's considered the father of the faithful. It's one thing when you obey, when you know where you're going. It's another thing when you obey and you don't know where. Those are two very different things. Abraham, he up and he left. Abraham was a rich man. It says there in verse 9, that he made some sacrifices. Jesus actually says in his teaching in the New Testament, he says it's very hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And Abraham, we know, was a very wealthy man. He had done very well. He had, back in those days, your wealth was by your herds and your flocks. And he had a lot. I'm sure he had a beautiful home. It's true, it takes faith for a wealthy person to curb their lifestyle. This was a big step down for Abraham, who was settled, who had all of this, growing wealth, to then just up and move and to take this stuff with him. It says that he lived in tents. That's a step down for a guy like Abraham. And then secondly, it says that his children followed him and came with him, and they also lived in tents. I can tell you guys from experience, it's one thing to live by faith yourself. It's another thing when you have to involve your family in your decisions. I can tell you, I can do a lot of things by faith if God's calling me to do it, but as a married man and as a father, when I have to consider the other people that I'm connected with and those commitments that I have, that gets tougher. Obedience to God's call becomes a bigger challenge. But Abraham did it by faith. In verse 10, it says that he was looking for a better city. Now, this is a double entendre here. Not only is he looking for the city, the place that God's leading him to, that would be better than Haran, where he was coming from, but the picture here is that ultimately that wasn't even the biggest thing Abraham was looking for. Abraham wanted God's commendation, and he was looking for that eternal city where he would eventually always be with God. This is the point the writer's making. His wife Sarah in verse 11 says, that Sarah was commended for her faith because she believed that God would give her a son. Now we know from the story she laughed at first. She's like, I'm really old, right? This isn't going to happen. They named the child Isaac because Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. But she still believed, and God rewarded her faith. And as a result of Abraham and Sarah's faith, innumerable descendants have come, not only the Jewish nation, but everyone who is a child of faith, the Bible says, is in a sense a child of Abraham. And that would include any of us who have believed in the truth and in Jesus. Well, starting at verse 13, and I read it there, there's a kind of an interlude that gets started. After telling the story of Abraham, he gets off onto a couple of other topics here. He takes a pause to draw the Hebrews' attention to something. And here's what he says in verse 13. He says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. And so the point that he's making is that you have to persevere to the end. Even if you don't get everything in relation to the faith that you exercise, even if you don't realize the fruit of your faith, that's okay. You keep going. You keep moving on. These Jews, they could have said a lot of things. They could have said, I've been following Jesus, but he hasn't returned yet. They were expecting Jesus to return very quickly in the first century after he left. They were thinking he was going to be very soon. They're like, he hasn't come back yet. I'm giving up on this. We're still being persecuted so much. I'm not going to hang in with this. Israel hasn't been brought back to prominence like we assumed the Messiah would do. I'm out of here. And we Christians, there's a lot of ways that we don't persevere to the end as well. Some people say, I've been following Jesus, but, I've been waiting for my spouse to get on the same page with me, and they just haven't done it, and I'm ready to give up. I haven't been successful. I'm being persecuted at school. There's all kinds of things that you could say. I haven't gotten a husband or a wife. I've asked God for this, and he hasn't come through for me in this, and, I'm losing faith. Well, listen, guys. The faith that we're seeing here that the writers described all through this book is a faith that perseveres to the end. It's a faith, it's going to test you. Do you really have faith? Are you someone that's just going to hang in there as long as blessings keep coming back to you? Or do you really have the kind of faith the Bible's talking about? A faith that is wholly committed to God no matter what the consequences. In verse 14, it says that these patriarchs had the right mentality. They saw themselves as foreigners and strangers. And Abraham definitely set that pattern for us, to leave a permanent residence and then to be in transition. He showed the ability to have a detachment from earthly trappings. Do you have that ability? Can you be detached enough from things that you would allow God to move you around, to have his way with what he's doing in your life, for you to change your plans? It takes a detachment. It means that we don't see this place and what's going on here as being the end-all and be-all of what God wants for me. These Jewish converts should have known better. God constantly removed the Israelites from their land in order to show them what he really desired from them. That's the lesson all through the Old Testament. Israel being separated from their land. God's trying to teach them, yes, I'm giving you this land, but the mentality you need to have is to be like strangers and aliens, because you're here for a bigger purpose than just to be part of this land. In verses 15 and 16, the writer gives us a great illustration for these Jewish converts. He uses the example of a country. He says if they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country. He says these people that were doing it right, their vision was in front of them. It wasn't behind them. They weren't looking back at everything that they left behind to follow God. They were moving forward in what he was calling them to. And this is huge. Guys, he's saying if you keep looking backward at what you left, you're no longer living by faith. Now think about this. Think about the stories you know in the Bible. Think about your own life. How tempting it is sometimes to look back at what you left. And these Jews, they knew their own forefathers, right? No sooner had God freed them from Egypt and they're going through the desert, they're looking backward. As soon as things get hard, they're already looking back. We should go back to Egypt. What? That's slavery. But they lost faith. These guys knew the stories, and they kept looking backward. They wanted to go back to their old religion. Let me ask you something. What keeps you looking backward? What is it? Is it worldly goals, fame and fortune, sexual pleasure, a wrong relationship that you just keep going after? What is it that keeps you looking backward? God's calling you here, and you just you're so distracted. What is it? What distraction, if you could just get rid of it, would enable you to pursue God's faith challenges that He's giving you with all of your being, with all of your might and all of your strength and all of your focus? What are the distractions you need to get rid of? Whatever they are, let me give you some encouragement. Get rid of them. In verse 16, he says, when we choose not to live by faith, God's actually ashamed of us. Did you catch that there? It says God is not ashamed to be called their God if they do these right things, which by inference is saying if we don't do them, if we shrink back, that God's ashamed of us. But when we do follow Him in faith, He takes pride in us, and He looks forward to the day when we finish our race and when we join Him in heaven and fellowship with Him. You know, it makes sense because He knows what we always wanted in the first place. For those people that pursue God by faith and persevere through their life, when they finally get there to be with God in heaven, He's going to say, welcome. He says, you know, you're finally in the place that you've been longing for the whole time. And it's all going to be so good, and the fellowship's going to be so sweet. But you know what? Some of us are going to get to heaven. I really believe this. Some of us are going to get to heaven, and Jesus is going to come up to us and say, oh, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry you had to come and join us here so soon. I know you were really wrapped up in the things that you were doing on earth. That was really important to you. Sorry that we had to cut that short and bring you here, right? Literally, I honestly think He's going to say that to some people. Because they're the kind of people that are always looking back. They're always worried about what they're doing here. And their eyes were not focused on a better country. Verses 17 to 19, let's keep reading. It says, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. You see, Abraham sacrificing Isaac, again, we're talking about the ante being raised on these faith challenges. Think about that one. God calls Abraham to climb Mount Moriah with his son. He's not taking any animal to sacrifice. Isaac's it. And he goes up there, and we know from the story, Abraham was ready to do it. He had the knife drawn before God stopped him. He was like on the way down, and God stopped him. Abraham's faith was so strong, it says here, that he believed that God would raise Isaac up from the dead if he actually followed through and had sacrificed him. That's how powerful his faith was. It's a picture of Christ's resurrection. Note something, guys. True faith requires that something dies. Something's got to die when it comes to faith. You can't pursue that which is invisible that God is calling you to without something else dying. Your own desires, your own will, your own goals, your own pride, whatever it is, something's got to die for you to pursue that. And this is a lesson Abraham had to learn. He had to even be willing to put his dearest possession, his son. This was the whole promise. Everything that God had promised Abraham, this whole nation thing that God was going to make, it was all embodied in his son, and he was ready to lay all of that down. Are you willing to lay down your most precious gifts, treasures, dreams for what God's calling you to? True faith requires that something dies. Isaac was a symbol of Abraham's greatest dreams and goals. Look at verses 20 to 22. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was near his end, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. And so the next three examples, guys, all have something in common. We're talking now about the next patriarchs. after Abraham. We're talking about Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. Now, if you go back and you study out the stories, you know the stories of each of these. But in each case, what you're going to see here is that in order to trust God and to follow him in faith, each of these guys had to look into the future and see that there's something that they're not able to control in the future if they're going to follow God by faith. That's what faith meant for them. They had to trust God for something that they couldn't control in the future. For Isaac, you know what? He messed up the blessing. You remember the story? He's got Jacob and Esau, his sons, and he gets tricked. Jacob's the trickster, right? And he tricks his dad into giving him the blessing, right? And Esau's crying, his dad, bless me too. And Isaac recognizes, I screwed this up. But he knew that the pronouncement of a blessing was irrevocable. He could not change it. He messed it up. And he had to keep going forward. And he had to trust God that God was still going to work through the promises of this nation despite his error. Let me ask you a question. Do you have the faith to trust that God can fix up what you've messed up? Because sometimes that's what holds us back. We're like, well, I've messed this thing up. Do you trust that God can work through your mistakes? He can. He can. And I know sometimes that's the biggest faith that we need sometimes. What about Jacob? Jacob never got to see the dream of Abraham's nation, right? He didn't get to see that all happen, but he did have all these sons, and so he blessed all of his sons, and he trusted God to finish the work. Guys, sometimes faith means trusting God to finish the work that you can't finish. You start down a road, you start down a path, you have a vision of what God's calling you to, and you do what you can, but you know some of it's not going to get done. But you trust God and you live with peace and you say, I'm going to be with you, and God, you've got to take care of that. You've got to do what I can't. Then there's Joseph. You know, he also trusted God to finish his work. When he was dying in Egypt, he reminded his sons of the Exodus and commanded that his bones be taken back to the land and be buried with Abraham's bones. You see, even in his death, what's the significance of that? He reminded his sons, guys, we came out of Egypt to be taken to this land that God was given, and even though I'm here in Egypt now, I want you to take my bones back to the land and to be buried with Abraham's bones. What was he saying? He's saying, there's a better place than this, and that's where I'm going. Even in death, he was focused on the better place that God wanted to take him to. His eyes were on the prize. Well, look at verse 23. We see another example of someone who couldn't control something. It says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Right at that time, they were slaughtering all of the boys. Pharaoh was slaughtering all of the baby boys. And so by faith, Moses' parents said, we got to do something. We got to save this child. They could tell, you read the story, they could tell he was a special child. So they went down and they put him in a basket in the bulrushes and they just pushed him out in the water. Imagine the faith, right? There's a lesson in that story, and that is that one act of faith and obedience can change the course of history. We don't learn anything else about Moses' parents, really, but we learn a lot about Moses, don't we? One act of faith changed the course of history. Let's look at verses 24 down to 28. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of a greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Moses, of course, he's going to spend a little more time on Moses here too, because Moses is like the second most revered person in the Jewish tradition. Right after Abraham, the founder of the nation, it's Moses who gave the law. And the writer here is highlighting the faith that it took to identify with the weaker group. Although he was in the palace, he was taken into Pharaoh's household, he saw his people being persecuted. And so he leaves the palace and all of the comfort of that, the pleasure of sin for a season, the writer describes it as. And he left that to go and be with his own people and to associate with their weakness and their frailty. Just as Moses had to act in faith to join the Jews, this writer is saying that these Jews needed to be acting in faith in order to be a part of what Christ was doing. In fact, in verse 26, do you see that? It says that Moses regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Guys, Christ didn't exist then, not as we know him, Christ. He wasn't even in the picture. But the writer is showing that God's plan through history has always been about Christ. And so when you embrace God's plan, you're embracing Christ. And when you embrace Christ, you're embracing God's plan. That's what he's saying. That Moses, in essence, was embracing Christ by embracing God's plan way back then to associate with his weak brothers and sisters. Let me ask you a question, guys. Have you come to accept that Christ is the meaning of history? And that for you to live for anything else in your life is just an illusion? Like you're literally chasing an illusion. Anything that is not founded in Christ and what he's doing, because he's the author of history, anything that you're doing that doesn't fit in with what he's doing, you're just wasting your time. It's literally an illusion. It's going to disappear and be remembered no more forever. Read Revelation and see. He's the author of history, and your life only has meaning in relation to the story that he is writing. And if you're not in his story, you're not anywhere. Verse 27, look at what it says. It says that he persevered in leaving Egypt. You see that? He used that word persevered again. Every time he uses that word, what's he doing? He's talking to these Jewish converts that are thinking of turning back, and he's saying, he persevered, right? What are you going to do? It's another reminder in verse 28 that the blood of the Passover is a picture of Christ. He brings that up specifically for this audience. Take note of that. That's very significant. Then in verse 29, we get to another group. It says, by faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Now here, actually, guys, the people that are being commended are the children of Israel. Wow. Think about that. Even the children of Israel get a couple of call-outs here in the chapter of faith. You say, wow, I never thought they would get in, right? They get two credits here in the faith chapter. The first one, it says here in verse 29, is that it took faith to follow behind Moses into the Red Sea. You see, Moses went with the staff and he parted the Red Sea, but it still took faith for them to follow him through. But they did, and they get commended for that. Here's a note. Sometimes, guys, it takes faith to follow a godly leader. Just because the leader's there and they're calling you to do something, it takes faith to follow them. I remind our staff, all of our campus pastors of this, right? We lead, we try to chart a direction, but it takes faith for you guys to follow. We understand that. The second thing here is that it says that they marched around Jericho until the walls fell. Verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. Now, here's the thing. It wasn't all of them that came through the desert that made it there. We know that from the story. But the ones that did, they're again commended. And again, I love the examples he's choosing. All of the examples that this writer is choosing from their history all have to do with perseverance. Are you noticing this? If you know the story of Jericho, what did they have to do for the walls of Jericho to fall? God told Joshua, go out, make them walk around the whole city the first day, right? And keep doing that every day, once. And then on the last day, on the seventh day, I want you to do it 7 times. So it's 6, and then 7 on the last day, it adds up to 13, which happens to be the number of chaos and rebellion in the Bible. And God brought chaos on Jericho that day, and the walls fell. But think about the perseverance. Like, what? We got to do this again? We got to march all around these walls again? And then on the last day, 7 times? What? Perseverance. If they'd have gone around 6 times, would the walls have fallen? Would they have fallen? No. It takes perseverance. Verse 31, he talks about Rahab. It says, by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what we have here with Rahab is the lesson of the greater moral good. I wish I had time to get into this in more depth this morning. You know, Christians have latched onto a phrase, the ends never justify the means. How many of you heard it before? The ends never justify the means. Unfortunately, that statement, although it's almost always true. One, is not in the Bible, and two, is not 100% always true. In very rare cases, what we see is that one must choose the lesser of two evils in order to preserve life. And you will see this very rarely, but it is something that you will see. Rahab actually lied. We know from the story that she lied to save the life of the spies. And here in the faith chapter, she is being commended for it. Did you get that? She's being commended for it. Now, I'm going to tell you, you will never hear the average pastor talk about this because they don't know what to do with it. I've listened for years, even people that speak on this passage. I've waited for a pastor to explain this because they lied. And they will tell you the ends never justify the means. She lied in order to save the life of these spies, and she's commended for it in the faith chapter. Like I say, the average pastor will never touch this. But I'm not the average pastor. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. She lied to save the life of the spies, and she's commended for it. And the lesson here is that these Jewish converts had to learn to see the nuance between what was good and what was better. You see, Judaism was good. At the time, it was what God was calling his people to do in order to be right with him. But it was until the time that Christ came, and when the better came, they needed to understand what was better. Jesus is better. That's what the writer's saying. And to not be able to distinguish between those things has huge consequences. Thank God Rahab had the ability to distinguish between what was good and what was better. True? Because guess who came from Rahab's line? Christ himself. You know, it would have been easy to leave paganism to follow Christ, but to leave Judaism to follow Christ, that's a little harder, a little trickier decision. It takes faith, and it's commendable to make the right choice in a hard situation. Guys, now the writer of the book, he stops speaking and he starts preaching. And I know I've gone long here this morning, but I love this next section. I love it. I've never been a big fan of dispassionate speech. It's the reason why I didn't go farther than I did in school. I got my master's degree and I said, I'm out of here. I can't handle any more of this scholasticism. You would write papers and you'd show any amount of passion, and they're like, you can't do that. I'm like, what? I got to go preach somewhere, right? It's like saying that you should only make decisions with your head and not with your heart. Faith requires you to engage your heart and your emotion. And this writer now has given enough of the rational arguments for why they should stick with Jesus by faith. He's been very, clinical, kind of going through, giving these examples and so on. But now, I love it. Now he's going to rapid fire and give them all of these amazing stories from their heritage that's going to show them why they should embrace Christ. And he's going to pull the emotion here out of this. He's going to show, listen, we're talking about faith, and you think this is such a big faith step that you're making? Let me tell you some stories that you need to know from your past, from your own heritage. Let me show you what faith really looks like. And so let's read it, starting at verse 32. He says, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received their dead, raised back to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Guys, this is brilliant, what he's writing here in this passage. He takes them through the history of suffering in Israel, and then he blends it right up into the present suffering of the Christians at that time. He brings it right to the present day, in fact, addressing the persecution that they had started to face. If you notice there, he even mentions the catacombs, caves and holes in the ground. You know what that is? That's a map of the catacombs under the city of Rome. You can go there today and still visit parts of this. You know how many kilometers of catacombs are down there? 600 kilometers. 600. Do you know how long the path is in Toronto that we brag about all the time? Anybody know? 30 kilometers. And it gets touted. This is this massive shopping region under the city of Toronto, right? 600 kilometers, 20 times the size of the path. That's what the catacombs are. That's literally where the Christians lived for long periods of time. Amongst the dead buried there, many of them their own. But there's a transition here in this passage that many translators have missed. In fact, if you look down at verse 39, he says, "These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them had received what had been promised." But if you actually look at the beginning of that section, the first ones did receive what they were promised. Did you notice that? In fact, that's the point that he's making here. The writer's making the point, listen, when you walk by faith, sometimes you receive the things that you're promised in your lifetime, and sometimes you don't. This is the point. This is the whole argument he's building here in this passage. There should actually be a break in verse 35, and the wording in Greek actually shows this. In fact, I could bring any seminary professor in here right now, and I could show them this, and they would look at it and they say, yep, you're right. But no translations are actually breaking this like they should. When you start in verse 32, you will see that many of the examples given, they did receive what was promised. And it's all until you get to the middle of verse 35. Once you get there, until you get to that point, everything's good. Did you notice that in the passage? Look at what it says. He mentions all of these people. Through faith, they conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised. They shut the mouths of lions. They quenched the fury of the flames. They escaped the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. Their dead were brought back to life again. Everything's good. They got what they wanted by faith. Wouldn't you love to be one of those people that you got to taste the fruit of your faith in your lifetime? It's an amazing privilege. An amazing privilege. But then you get to the middle of verse 35, and something happens there. And it says even in verse 33, that first group, they gained what was promised, it says in verse 33. The women even had their dead raised back to life. Hallelujah. We're loving life. We're tasting the fruit of our faith. But here's the thing. There's a second set of examples. And the break should happen in the middle of verse 35. It doesn't show up in English translations. But there should actually be a new paragraph that starts there. The conjunction de in Greek, which often is translated but, and there's actual constructions with that word dead that show that on one hand this, on the other hand this, and that's often how it's used, is what's going on here. When you get to verse 35, the middle of it, it says aloi de. And there should be a new paragraph that starts there. He was talking about this first group that received what they got by faith, but then you get to the middle of verse 35, it says aloi de, but others, no. And now he's going to talk about that group. And do you see what he says about that group? Look at how things changed for that group. Others were tortured. Some refused to be released because they wanted to gain a better resurrection. They faced all of these different things. They were chained, they were stoned, they were cut in two, they were sliced by the sword. These guys didn't get anything that they were promised. You see the difference, guys? The writer of to these Hebrews wants them to understand that a few of us are so blessed to receive the fruit of our faith in our lifetime. All of these in the first half saw great victories. They tasted the fruit. But the writer wants his readers to know that's the exception. And I want you guys to know this morning too, that's the exception. Most of us will never see the greatest fruit of our faith. Abraham certainly didn't get to. But that should only make us happier because it says here we're actually more blessed. You see that in verses 39 and 40? These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised since God had planned something better for us. This book is all about what's better. You notice that? It's all about what's better. Jesus is better, and you know what? Not getting everything you're promised in your lifetime is actually better. Because then together with us, they're going to be made perfect. They're going to get a richer blessing, he says, someday in heaven. Guys, a day is coming when all of us who never got to taste the fruit of our faith here in this lifetime, we're going to get to sit down with God and we're going to taste it. In fact, sometimes I look at the imagery of the marriage supper of the Lamb that we talk about that's coming for the children of God in heaven, and I wonder if that's what the supper is. I wonder if in some spiritual way we're going to get to taste the fruit of our faith for persevering through all of it, and then something amazingly delicious we're going to experience in heaven. It's going to be amazing. And it will be worth more than every sacrifice and every bit of suffering. And so I want to address you guys this morning. We've been talking about this group of Hebrew converts, but there's applications here for us too. You who are getting tired of serving, you need to find your second wind. Mom, you who are raising a disabled child, don't give up. You who are struggling with pornography, you need to keep on struggling. You who have doubts, you need to keep on studying and you need to keep on seeking. You who are mocked at school for your faith, don't cave in. You who are making mistakes, join the club. Get back up on the horse and keep on trying. You who have been misunderstood, remember that God knows and keep on going. You who are praying for your kids every night that they would come back to God, you need to keep soaking your pillow with tears and you need to keep on praying for them. You who have been hurt by other Christians, you need to lick your wounds, you need to forgive them, and you need to move on and keep going. And you who have been wondering, where are the blessings in following Jesus? You need to not turn back. Don't turn back. Everything you need, everything you want, everything you truly desire is in Christ. That's the lesson here. Salvation is in Him alone. Eternal blessings, real life, real significance, real hope. It's all in Him. And if you never see the fruit of your faith in this life, if you never see it, know that your reward in heaven is only going to be that much greater, that much tastier. I want to end this morning with a story of a man that I love very much. He's a man named Doug Virgent. As a young Anglophone, he felt called by God to go to Quebec and to be a minister of the gospel there. He did not have a great upbringing. His dad was an alcoholic. And when I first met Doug, I really liked him because he was kind of crusty. Had a little edge to him. But I tell you, his faith was very, very deep. He became a pillar in the church in Quebec. In fact, everybody kind of knew that Doug was the head elder. He wouldn't admit it, but he was. And he was one of the most popular Christians in the Mauricie region of Quebec. I know that he dreamed of seeing all of Quebec turn to Jesus. I know that that was his dream, of seeing it transformed. He started a copy business. He started a publishing house so he could translate works into French that were so lacking during those days. He translated resources. He hired young people right out of Bible school that could work in his businesses and in the church. He actually remembers the days when the Catholics would vandalize the Protestant churches in Quebec. He showed me pictures. They'd flip cars. They'd be in on the Sunday service, and there'd be people starting fires outside and flipping cars. You think that it's like, just come to church, right? What do you think of that? He remembers those days. When my wife wanted to go to a camp in Ontario when she was a teenager, she wanted to work for a summer. Doug wanted her to stay in Quebec so much that he paid her to go to a camp in Quebec. His heart bled for Quebec. When I graduated from seminary, he actually led the elders of his church to invite me onto the staff of their church where Sarah grew up, even though I didn't speak French. Details, right? Details. When we moved there, he knew that we couldn't survive on just what the church was paying, so he gave my wife a job at his copy business, Copy Express. He worked tirelessly. He was always working. And I got to see the inside. I actually knew that some Christians, even Christians in Quebec who you expected more of, I knew that some of them would never accept Doug in the way that they would accept a pure laine, a real Quebecer. And I could see it, and my heart broke for him. A lot of people did, but there were always some that just would never really accept him. When God called me here in Ontario in 1995, it was hard telling Sarah's parents that we were being called somewhere else, but the hardest one for me to tell was Doug, because I knew that he invested a lot in me, and he really had a passion for Quebec. Years after I left, I heard stories of how his own church accused him of stuff, and I know how that stuff can go. A few years ago, his church, the one that I was actually married in, burnt down, burnt to the ground. But he has continued to serve way beyond retirement years. He's continuing to translate books. He's continuing to invest in young leaders. And now, just recently, the last thing I learned is that he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. What do you do with that? Guys, I'm pretty sure that Doug will never see his dreams for Quebec realized. All of the things that he had hoped. The fruit of his faith. But I want you guys to know Doug is a hero of the faith. And there's many people in English Canada and beyond that will never, ever even know his name. But I tell you what, he's a hero of the faith. And all of the books are still not written. And guys, you need to persevere. You need to not give up. Don't give up.